I'm going to run through how I process a bald eagle, starting in Lightroom and possibly using other things. The first thing to make sure is that you start with an acceptable photograph. This includes that the histogram is acceptable. So even if it's underexposed or overexposed a little, that the whites are not blown out and that there's not too many blown out shadows. The second thing is to zoom in to the most important part of the photograph. In this case, the eyes are what I would like to have at least in focus. And we see that that's excellent, and that the talons and the body of the bird are all sharp, but I'm most concerned about the head, especially the eye, and that looks acceptably sharp to me. So what I do next is say how much of this frame is important, and I'm going to just crop down and say I want something like a 5:7 and get the bird to occupy about a third of the frame overall, and get a pleasing composition. Because this bird is facing straight on, I think that having him centered looks pretty acceptable. It might bring the tail down a little lower so the head's not at the top of the frame, and then press enter. There's our new composition. I can decide whether the temperature is adequate, maybe warm it up slightly to bring out the brown of the body to a more normal. Tend to overshoot it sometimes at first, so bring it back maybe a little bit. I think the tint is okay. The exposure, in general, it's a dark frame, so having it to the left of center may be okay. We can try bringing it up a little bit and then see what happens as we reduce the highlights. And this is the key to bringing out detail in the head feathers. If you go too far, they may look dirty, so let's bring it in and see. Now you can see more detail. So let's show you again without the adjustment. This looks blown out, but the detail is there if we just bring the highlights down. And then it's starting to look a little dirty, but if we bring the whites back up, you can see that it looks better than before. So here's the right end of the histogram, and we have not blown it. Otherwise, this arrow, I'll show you what happens if we bring the whites up too high. You can see that this arrow has turned white, and when we hover over that, you can see the red on the bird indicating the blown out areas. And so if we just bring that back to about there, or maybe even slightly less, we have good detail in the head feathers now, and we can play with that highlights a little bit and see where we really like it now. And normally I'd be bringing the shadows up most of the time to bring out the body of the bird, but in this case we might actually want to bring them down. You see the black is already into a white area just barely without having to adjust it. It's in a good place. We might just bring down those shadows a little bit and see what happens. And I'm going to zoom out again, and that's looking pretty good. Now the contrast is something that we can play with later or now. And we may want to do that overall. So let's see what happens with that overall if we bring up the contrast a little bit and maybe the clarity just a touch. You don't want to overdo the clarity or they start looking metallic like that. So you want to be very careful with how much of this you put in. And don't forget you can use other selective clarity type programs like Topaz to adjust that. Now that I've done that clarity step, I might want to bring my highlights up slightly so that the cape looks a little less dirty. And you know, you can deal with the selective areas of the bird by going into a radial filter. I'm thinking this looks pretty good as it is, but I'm going to see about bringing those shadows down just a little more. And now that I've done that, maybe just a slight increase in the contrast. And that's looking pretty good as it is. I'm going to go down to make sure my chromatic aberrations and lens profiles are selected, and come back up to sharpening. I'm going to concentrate my sharpening on the eye area, and this is already at 1:1, as you can see over to the left upper navigator here. And when I do this, I usually press on the Alt or Option key and start bringing up the sharpness, and then go down to the radius and decide how much of that I need, and then the detail slider. That's looking pretty good. And then go back up to the sharpening, and I think that's a perfect amount right there. So now you can see quite a bit of detail in the feathers. We can go to 2:1 and make sure that we're not over sharpened. And you can see that these areas on 2:1 look grainy. At 1:1, not too bad, and in a print that will probably kind of blur together, but we can also soften that in a layer. Overall, I'm thinking this is almost done. However, there's some things we can do. If you find an area of the bird that you want to work on, you can use a radial filter like so, and here I have the radial filter inverted, and I don't want it this bright. I'm going to just reset all these by double clicking on them, and then I might bring down the blacks just a little bit to get a little more contrast in there.